She stepped off the last train into nothing. No husband waiting, no familiar face, just three silent mountain men, 100 miles of wilderness, and a contract that bore only one name. She had $19, a worn letter, and a decision she had made with her eyes open. They thought she would leave before the first snow. The two women before her had. But Clara Whitfield had not come this far to turn back, and what she found behind a locked door at the end of the upstairs hall would change everything she thought she understood about this house, these men, and what it truly meant to stay. This is her story. The snow had not yet fallen, but it was coming. You could feel it in the way the air pressed down on the platform, heavy and colorless, carrying the particular stillness that precedes great change. The mountains to the north had already swallowed the sun an hour before sunset should have taken it, and the shadows across Copper Falls stretched long and blue over the frozen mud of the station yard. Clara Whitfield stood alone on the platform with one leather valise, a hat box tied with cord, and a letter folded so many times the creases had worn nearly through the paper. She had read that letter every day for 19 days. She did not read it now. She knew every word. She knew the precise economy of its sentences, the absence of ornamentation, the way it stated facts without apology, and made promises without decoration. It was the letter of a man who did not believe in wasting words, and it was exactly that quality, that bone-deep plainness, that had made her choose it from the 14 others spread across her father's desk in Boston on a gray March morning that now felt like it belonged to someone else's life. The letter was signed by a man named Elias Monroe Calloway. He was not here. The station master, a thin man with the permanent stoop of someone who had spent decades ducking under low door frames, had confirmed the train's arrival time 3 times when she asked, growing more uncomfortable with each inquiry. The afternoon light was failing. The other passengers, who had disembarked 2 cattle buyers and a Methodist preacher bound for Billings, had long since collected their things and disappeared into the town beyond the depot fence. Clara remained and the station master remained, and the silence between them grew less polite by the minute. She was not afraid. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. Fear was an emotion that required uncertainty about one's own capacity to endure. And Clara Whitfield had learned in the 2 months since her father's death that her capacity for endurance was considerably larger than she had previously understood. What she felt standing on that platform in the dying light of a Montana October was something closer to calculation. She was calculating distances. The nearest town of any size was Helena, 4 hours south by rail. She had $17.40 in the lining of her right boot, sewn there by her own hand, before leaving Boston. She had a letter of introduction from the Marshfield and Associates Matrimonial Agency on Beacon Street, notarized and bearing a red wax seal. She had in the bottom of her valise, beneath 3 changes of practical clothing, a copy of the territorial land records for Calloway Ridge Ranch, which she had requested through the Boston Athenaeum before departing, because she was the daughter of a librarian, and she understood that information was the only protection available to people who could not afford any other kind. Calloway Ridge had been registered continuously since 1864. The property taxes were paid. The deed was clean. The 3 brothers named as co-holders of the property had no outstanding legal judgments against them. She had done her research. She had chosen well. She was simply standing alone on a platform in the cold because no one had come to collect her, and that fact required a response. She picked up her valise and walked toward the town. The station master called after her. She turned. "Purcell's," he said, gesturing vaguely eastward along the main street, avoiding her eyes. "If you need a place to wait, Agnes Purcell. She knows everyone." Clara nodded, once thanked him, and walked. Copper Falls in October had the concentrated look of a place that had decided to take itself seriously without being entirely certain it deserved to. The main street held a hardware store, a land office, a saloon that was doing considerably more business than the church beside it, and at the far end, past a farrier's yard and a shuttered millinery, a general store with amber light glowing warm in its windows. The sign above the door read simply Purcell. Inside, the smell hit her first. Coffee and pine resin and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Wood smoke and something sweet molasses perhaps, and beneath all of it, the particular mineral scent of cold mountain air that had been let in and warmed and let in again until it became part of the building itself. It was the smell of a place that had been lived in, genuinely lived in for a long time. A woman behind the counter looked up. She was perhaps 56 with gray braided back from a strong, plain face, and the kind of stillness in her eyes that belonged to people who had outlasted several different versions of the life they had expected to have. She looked at Clara, at the valise, at the hat box, at the letter that Clara was still, without quite realizing it, holding in her left hand. "You're Calloway's girl," the woman said. It was not a question. "Clara Whitfield," Clara said. "From Boston." "Agnes Purcell." The woman came around the counter and pulled out a chair from the small table near the stove without being asked. "Sit down. I'll pour coffee." She did not ask whether Clara wanted coffee. This was Clara would come to understand simply how Agnes Purcell operated. She identified what was needed and provided it without ceremony. And if you were sensible, you accepted. Clara sat. The coffee came strong and black in a tin cup that had been warmed on the stove. Clara wrapped both hands around it and felt for the first time since the train had crossed into Montana territory, something loosened slightly in her chest. "There are 3 of them," Agnes said, sitting across from her with her own cup. "In case the letter didn't make that clear." "It made it clear enough," Clara said. "The contract is in the name of Elias Calloway. The eldest, yes, he runs the place, has since their father died." Agnes turned the cup between her palms. "Seth is the middle one, 31. He builds things, fixes things, doesn't say much, but when he does, it means something. And the youngest is Arlo, 27. He's the one who looks after the animals and would rather be outside than in regardless of the weather." Clara filed each piece of information in the particular mental drawer where she kept facts that would prove important later. "How long have the women stayed?" she asked. "Before." Agnes looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You do ask the direct question. I find it saves time." "2 of them, one in 1871 and 1872. Neither made it through the first winter. The house has a weight to it." Agnes paused. "There's a room at the end of the upstairs hall that stays locked. The boys don't talk about it. The women who came before you both asked about it, and both found the answer harder to carry than they expected." Clara thought about this. She did not ask what was in the room. She understood that some information needed to be earned rather than extracted. "Why didn't any of them come to meet me?" she asked instead. Agnes looked out the window at the darkening street. "They were arguing about who should go." She said it simply, without particular judgment. "They've been arguing about this arrangement since the summer. Elias agreed to it for practical reasons. Seth agreed to it because Elias did, and because Seth trusts his brother's practical reasons even when he doesn't share them. Arlo is the one who wanted it." Clara set down her cup. "Arlo is the youngest." "He is." "The letter was signed by Elias." It was. There was something Agnes was not saying, some connective tissue between these facts that the older woman was leaving for Clara to find on her own. Clara could feel the shape of it without yet being able to name it, and she stored that feeling alongside the other things she was keeping. The door opened. Cold air came first, and then the man himself, and he was taller than the door frame, comfortably accommodated, which explained the hat he removed the moment he stepped inside, ducking out of habit or courtesy or both. He was young, or younger than the other 2 would prove to be, with the sun-darkened skin of someone who spent most of his life outdoors, in the faint shadow of a beard that had been started without much conviction. His coat was good, practical, and warm, and his boots were the boots of a working man, resoled and resoled again until the leather had assumed a geography of its own. His hands, when he pulled off his gloves, were a rancher's hands, calloused, scarred, strong. But the inside of his right thumb carried a faint dark stain that was not oil and not soil and not the residue of any work Clara knew to name until she looked more carefully. ink. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and his voice was low and roughened by the cold. His breath came in visible pulls. He had been running or close to it. "I apologize for being late. The North Road iced early. I'm Arlo Calloway." "I know," Clara said. He blinked. She stood, collected her valise, and set the hat box on top of it. "Shall we go?" Agnes squeezed Clara's hand as she passed a brief, solid grip and said nothing. She did not need to. Clara had understood from the first 3 minutes in this room that Agnes Purcell was the kind of woman whose silence told you more than other people's speeches, and what her silence said now was, be careful but not too careful. Trust slowly but begin. Outside, the wagon waited. It was a working wagon, not a carriage, with a bench seat worn smooth by years and 2 heavy blankets folded on one side. The mule stamped in the cold breath, rising white. Arlo loaded her valise with efficient hands and helped her up to the bench with a steadiness that was neither performative nor awkward. Simply practical, a man helping someone up who needed the help. They moved through Copper Falls and out the far side, and the town fell away behind them, and ahead was the mountain. There was a great deal of mountain. Clara had grown up with the ocean on one horizon and Beacon Hill on another, with the narrow vertical emphases of city architecture and the contained geography of streets that had names and purposes and destinations. She had read about the Western Territories extensively, the landscape and the distances, but reading had not prepared her for the quality of the silence out here, or for the way the mountains did not merely exist at the edge of the landscape, but organized the entire world around themselves, so that everything below them, the road, the wagon, the 2 people sitting on the bench, seemed to exist only by the mountain's permission. "Have you been to Marshfield's offices?" Clara asked. She was watching the road ahead, not him. "No," Arlo said. "I wrote to them. The letter that was sent to me came from Boston. It was signed by your brother." A pause. Not long, but enough. "Elias handled the legal correspondence," Arlo said. "The contract needed his name. He's the primary holder on the deed." "And the other letter," Clara said, "the one that described the morning light on the north face of the ridge, the one that mentioned what the horses sound like in the first snow." The silence that followed was longer than the first one. She had not brought the second letter with her from Boston. She had left it in the lining of the valise, where the ink on the fold lines had transferred to the leather. She did not need to show it to him. She had memorized it as thoroughly as the first. "I don't know what you're referring to," Arlo said, and he was not a good liar. He was possibly the worst liar she had yet encountered, which was in its own way a comfort. "All right," Clara said, and let it go. She would let it go for now. She was a patient woman when patience served a purpose, and she understood that she had just arrived in a place she did not yet understand, with people she did not yet know, and that pressing at every question to its conclusion on the first night would be as useful as trying to read a map in the dark. There was time. The road wound upward through stands of ponderosa pine that grew increasingly close together as the altitude increased, their trunks straight and reddish in the failing light, their shadows falling across the packed earth of the trail in long, regular lines that the wagon wheels crossed and recrossed. The cold deepened. Clara pulled the blanket across her lap and watched the way the mountains shifted around them as they climbed new angles, revealing themselves. New distances opening and closing, the landscape folding and unfolding like a document being read. "You're colder than you're letting on," Arlo said. "I'm fine." "There's another blanket." "I said I'm fine." He did not argue. He reached across without looking at her and lifted the second blanket and placed it across the first one and returned his hands to the reins, and that was the end of it. Clara did not thank him. She pulled the second blanket tighter and felt again that quality of practical kindness that asked for nothing in return, and filed it in the appropriate drawer. Calloway Ridge came into view around a long bend in the trail, set against the north face of a mountain whose summit had disappeared into cloud. It was larger than she had imagined from the land records, which had described acreage, but could not convey scale. The main house was 2 stories of squared timber with a covered porch running the full front face in amber light in several windows and smoke rising straight from the chimney in the still air. Behind it, a long barn, a separate forge building with a stone chimney of its own, 2 storage structures, and a system of corrals and fencing that extended up the eastern slope until the terrain made it impractical. This was not a homestead. This was a working ranch built by people who intended to stay. Clara felt something inside her ease another fraction. A man was standing on the porch. He had not come down to the yard to watch them arrive. He was simply standing there, which said something about him, she thought. Not rudeness necessarily, but a deliberate quality, as though he had decided precisely how much motion the situation warranted and was allocating it accordingly. Elias Calloway was large in the way that certain men are large, not merely tall or broad, but densely present, as though the air around him had a different specific gravity than the air elsewhere. He was 35 and looked at weathered in the face in the way that outdoor work and grief in equal measure will weather a man with a jaw set by habit rather than tension and eyes the color of good bourbon that caught the porch light and did not give much back. He watched her descend from the wagon. Clara straightened her coat, lifted her chin to the angle she had learned from her father, which was the angle that said, "I have not come this far to be found lacking," and looked at him. "Miss Whitfield," he said. His voice was deeper than his brother's, and quieter, the kind of voice that did not need volume, because it had learned that the room would go quiet if it simply spoke. "Mr. Calloway." She held his gaze. "I apologize for the late hour. The road was iced." "The road's been iced since September," he said. It was not an accusation. It was just a fact, and he was a man who stated facts. "Come inside." He turned and went in. She followed. The inside of the house struck her first as functional and second as inhabited by ghosts, not in any supernatural sense, but in the way that spaces struck her when they had been shaped by people who were no longer in them or no longer quite present in them. The furniture was good and plain and matched in quality without matching in style, as though accumulated across years rather than purchased at once. The kitchen at the far end was large and equipped seriously with a wood stove that radiated a formidable heat and a table that could have seated 8 but currently held settings for 4. Seth Calloway was at the stove. He turned when she entered and gave her the same quality of assessment, quick and complete, the evaluation of a man who made structural judgments and understood that the structural judgment was final. He had auburn hair and the kind of physical stillness that did not come from laziness but from an excess of controlled power. His hands around the wooden spoon were the hands of a man who worked iron for a living, scarred across the knuckles and enormous in his eyes. When they settled on her were the amber of his brother's, but darker, more guarded. "Evening," he said. "Good evening," Clara said. He turned back to the stove. She was shown to her room by Arlo, who carried her valise up the stairs with the careful attention of someone who had been specifically instructed to be careful about something. The room was at the east corner of the second floor, with a window that would catch the morning light over the ridge, and a bed with a thick quilted cover, and a small table with a lamp already lit. The room was simple and cold and clean, and on the door there was a lock new enough that the mechanism was still bright and the strike plate still showed the marks of recent installation. Someone had put that lock there recently. For her. Clara stood in the middle of the room and turned in a slow circle, reading the space the way her father had taught her to read a room. The lamp was good quality, not a ranch hand's lamp. The pillow cover was embroidered at the edge with a small border pattern, not elaborate but deliberate, done by someone who had cared about doing it carefully. The window latch worked smoothly. She was expected. She had been prepared for. She unpacked, methodically hanging her 2 good dresses and placing her practical clothes on the shelf, setting her father's copy of Humboldt's Cosmos on the bedside table next to the lamp, arranging her writing things in the small drawer. She paused at the bottom of the valise and lifted out the folded land records and set them on the table because it was useful to remember what you knew. Dinner was eaten at the big kitchen table in a silence that was not hostile but not yet comfortable. Seth had made a beef stew that was better than it needed to be, thick and well-seasoned with sourdough bread that had been baked that morning. The bread told her something. Arlo had said there was no woman at the ranch, and there was no woman at the ranch, which meant that one of these three men baked bread, and that man was not the one who had met her at the door with crossed arms. She looked at Seth, who was eating with his eyes on his bowl. She looked at Arlo, who was looking at his brother. She looked at Elias, who was looking at her. When their eyes met, neither of them looked away immediately. He was doing what she was doing, making an inventory. She did not find this uncomfortable. She preferred people who looked at what they needed to look at rather than pretending they did not need to look. The contract, Elias said at the end of the meal, and pushed a folded document across the table toward her. Clara opened it and read it in full. She was the daughter of a librarian. She read everything in full. The terms were what Marshfield had represented. She would maintain the household manage accounts and supplies, and serve as legal spouse to the primary deed holder of Callaway Ridge Ranch, Elias Monroe Callaway, in exchange for room board legal protection under the territory's wife's rights statutes and a sum held in trust against contingency. The document bore one name, one signature line, one legal party. She looked up. Seth and Arlo had exchanged a glance. In the moment she looked up, a glance brief and compressed as a single word, and she caught only the tail end of it before they both found other things to look at. But she had seen it. She stored it. "I'll need it until morning," she said. Elias nodded. She folded the document, held it, and looked around the table at the three of them and said, "Thank you for supper." Then she took her lamp and went upstairs. She did not sleep for some time. She lay with the lamp low and listened to the sounds of the house, which were many. The wood stove ticking as it cooled. The wind that had started from the north after full dark pushing against the window glass with a low sound that was not quite a whistle. Footsteps below the two heavier sets and one lighter moving through the evening routines of men who had lived together long enough that their movements had become habitual and quiet. A door, the sound of wood being set on a fire. And then past midnight, when the house had grown still, something else. Footsteps in the hall, not floorboards settling, not the random creak of a structure adjusting to temperature. These were deliberate, slow, moving down the hallway toward the far end. Clara did not move. The footsteps stopped. She waited, her breath steady, listening to the silence on the other side of the wall. Whoever stood in that hallway stood there for a long time, not moving, simply present in the dark in front of the door at the end of the corridor, the one with the heavy lock. Then the footsteps returned slow and even and descended the stairs, and the house was quiet again. Clara lay still for a long time after that, looking at the ceiling beams above her and thinking about locks that were meant to keep things in rather than keep people out. She was up before anyone. She dressed quickly in the cold, made herself presentable without vanity, and took her lamp into the hall. The corridor was empty and gray, with pre-dawn light from a window at the near end. She walked its length without hurrying, cataloging 4 doors on the right, including her own one on the left at the end of a short jog. That door was heavier than the others, constructed of planks rather than panels, with a padlock hasp that held a lock as new as the one on her own door, but installed with considerably more intentionality. She did not touch the lock. She continued down the stairs. The kitchen was empty, but the stove was still warm. She built the fire back up without difficulty, having been shown the wood box location by Arlo the night before, and put water on for coffee and stood in the growing warmth of the kitchen, thinking about what she had seen and what she had not yet seen and what lay in the space between. While the water heated, she moved through the front room, reading it as she had read the bedroom the night before. The furniture's substantial, old, well-maintained. A rifle on pegs above the door in a position of practical accessibility. 2 armchairs before the fireplace, each worn to the specific shape of the body that used it, which told her which chair belonged to whom before she had spent a single full day in this house. A shelf of books, primarily practical, surveying and animal husbandry, and 1 volume on territorial land law, but also tucked between the land law and a cattle almanac, a thin book of poetry that looked as though it had been read rather than displayed. She ran her finger along the poetry book's spine and did not pull it out. And then in the corner behind the second armchair where the light from the window reached it only obliquely, a picture frame placed face in against the wall. She crossed the room and looked at it without touching it. It was a simple frame painted wood, and the back of the canvas it held was a plain buff color that told her nothing. The wall behind it showed a slightly lighter rectangle where the frame had hung for some time before being turned, which told her the frame had been turned relatively recently. She heard the stair creak. She moved back toward the kitchen in the same motion she would have used to take a step in any other direction unhurried, and Elias was already in the doorway when she reached the stove where she had found something to attend to near the coffee water. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Coffee's nearly ready," she said. Something moved in his eyes very briefly, like a man who has been expecting one thing and received another. Then it was Guido, and he came into the kitchen and took down 2 cups from the shelf with the automatic ease of someone who knew exactly where everything in this kitchen lived, and she noted that he took 2 cups, not one, and set them on the table and sat down. "Before you sign anything," he said, "there are things I should say." She sat across from him and poured the coffee and waited. "The contract is legal and the terms are fair. Marshfield's arrangement is legitimate. I want you to understand that nothing you were told was a lie." He wrapped both hands around the cup in a gesture that was so exactly what his youngest brother had done the night before in the cold of the wagon that Clara felt the family resemblance suddenly viscerally in a way that the physical similarity of their faces had not quite accomplished. "What you weren't told is that there have been 2 women here before you, in 1870 and 1872. Neither stayed." "Agnes Purcell told me as much," Clara said, a slight tightening around his eyes. "Agnes talks. Agnes informed me of relevant facts. I would have asked for them regardless." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The house has a history. It's not a comfortable one. The previous women found it more than they wanted to carry." "What's in the room at the end of the hall?" Clara asked. The silence that came then was of a different quality than the silences that had preceded it. It was the silence of a man who had been asked a question he had been carrying for a long time without anyone being willing to ask it. "It belonged to our sister," he said. He did not offer more. She did not ask for more, not yet. She looked at the contract on the table, still folded where she had left it. "I'll sign it," she said, "but I want you to understand something first." He waited. "I came here by choice," she said, "not by desperation. I researched this property and this family and this territory before I spent $1 of what remained of my inheritance on a train ticket. I know what the territorial land laws say about homesteads and inheritance rights. I know what Copper Falls County has recorded in its deed office for the past 10 years. I chose Callaway Ridge because the records indicated stability and because the letter I received indicated honesty." She paused. "I expect honesty to continue. In return, I will give you the same." Elias looked at her for a long time. "That's fair," he said. "There's one more thing." He waited again. "I need to know what I'm signing into, not today necessarily, but before the first snow." She held his gaze. "Sooner or later." Something shifted in his face, barely perceptible, like the small movement of a heavy door on well-oiled hinges. "Sooner or later," he said. She signed the contract. That afternoon, a carriage she had not heard approach appeared in the yard, and the man who descended from it was not any of the 3 she had come to expect. He was in his 50s, dressed in black, with the care of a man who wished to communicate authority, with a face constructed for expressions of concern that did not reach the eyes behind them. "The new Mrs. Callowell," he said when Clara appeared on the porch, and his voice was honey over iron. "What a blessing for our little community." Elias came out behind her, and something changed in the atmosphere of the porch, a density and alertness. "Reverend," Elias said. "Hiram Dole," the man said to Clara, extending a hand that she shook briefly. "I minister to the First Congregation in Copper Falls, and I consider it my Christian duty to welcome any new soul to our valley." His eyes moved across her face with the quick cataloging efficiency of a man who dealt in property. You must find it very remote up here coming from the east. I find it exactly what I expected, Clara said. The smile did not change. That in her experience was always the tell. A genuine smile responds to what is actually said. A constructed one does not. Dole spoke with Elias for some minutes at the far end of the porch while his man, a large person named Harker, who had the look of someone employed specifically for his size, waited by the carriage. Clara stood near the door and did not attempt to hear what was said. She watched instead the quality of the exchange, Elias's stillness, the studied neutrality of his body, the way his hands did not move at all during the entire conversation. Controlled. Very controlled. Dole left with his smile intact and said one more thing to Clara as he passed. If you ever find yourself in need of anything, Mrs. Calloway, any assistance at all, our doors are always open. A beat. It can be a difficult life out here without neighbors nearby. It was said pleasantly. She heard it as a warning anyway. Seth came out of the forge as the carriage disappeared down the trail. He did not come all the way to the porch, but stopped near the corral fence and looked at Clara with a directness that his silence had not previously offered. What did he say to you? He offered his assistance, Clara said. Seth made a sound that was not quite contempt and not quite something else. Don't accept it, he said. Don't go to his church. Don't speak with his man, Harker, if you can avoid it. Don't let him in the house if Elias isn't here. Has he harmed someone? Clara asked. He's in the process of trying to, Seth said, and went back to the forge. That night after supper, after the lamps were banked and the brothers had gone to their rooms, Clara sat at the small desk in her room with her lamp turned low and opened the valise to retrieve her writing paper. The letter was at the bottom as it had been since Boston. Not the formal letter, the one that bore the Calloway contract's voice all practical fact in plainly stated terms. The other one, the one she had not mentioned to Arlo not directly when she had told him on the wagon that she knew about it. She had found it in a drawer at Marshfield's office's slip behind the standard correspondence folder when the clerk had stepped away for a moment, and she had, in the manner of her father's daughter, used the moment to look at everything available to her. The envelope bore an E. Calloway as the sender, which was the name on all the Calloway correspondence, but the handwriting was not the handwriting of the formal letter. It was different in the way that someone who writes with feeling is different from someone who writes with precision, more pressure on the nib slight inconsistencies of letter height, the evidence of a pen guided by something other than calculation. She had taken it. She was not proud of that precisely, but she had been practical about it. She unfolded it now. The morning light on the north face turns the rock the color of copper an hour after sunrise. That is where the town gets its name, though most of the people in the town have never been high enough to see it properly. The horses know when the first snow is coming before any instrument can measure it. They stand closer together, and their breath comes in longer pulls, and there is a particular sound in the herd that I have never heard at any other time. I do not know how to describe it except to say it sounds like the land preparing itself. She had read this letter 11 times on the train. She had read it a 12th time now. The handwriting was Arlo's. She had confirmed that the moment she saw the inscription in a book of poems he had left on the kitchen table, to AC in his own hand, the same ink pressure, the same slight forward lean of the letters. Why the formal contract bore the older brother's name when the younger one had written the letter that actually chose her? This was one of the questions she intended to have answered before the first snow. She put the letter away, folded carefully along its original lines. She was reaching for her writing paper when she heard the footsteps again. Down the hall, slow, deliberate, weighted with something that was not merely physical mass. They stopped at the end of the corridor. The padlock made a small sound, the sound of a hand resting on metal or a thumb running across a keyhole. Then nothing for a long time. Then the footsteps came back. Clara sat perfectly still at her desk until the house was quiet again. She thought about a room that was kept locked, not to protect those outside it from what was inside, but to protect what was inside from the particular cruelty of being changed, moved, modified, made to seem less than it had been. She thought about a sentence in a diary she had not yet read, ending in the middle of a thought. She thought about a man standing in a dark hallway at midnight, unable to open a door and unable to walk away from it. She thought about what it might mean to stay in a house that carried this much weight, and whether staying was something she was equal to, and she found to her own mild surprise that the question did not frighten her. Her father had kept a room like that too. Not a physical room, a room inside himself where he kept the inventory of everything that had gone wrong, everything that had been lost, every version of the life he had imagined that had not materialized. He had kept it locked for 17 years after her mother's death, and she had watched the locked room consume him slowly, like a fire that has no fuel except the walls of the house itself. She knew the architecture of that kind of grief. She turned down the lamp. In the morning, she would begin to learn what she needed to learn. She had come here by choice, and she intended to stay. The first week passed like a sentence being carefully constructed one word at a time with long pauses between. Clara rose before anyone each morning. This was not strategy. It was simply who she was, a woman who had spent years opening a library before the city woke, who had learned that the early hours belonged to people willing to claim them. She built the fire, put water on, and used the quiet time to move through the house in the way her father had taught her to move through a new collection systematically, without preconception, looking at what was actually there rather than what she expected to find. What she found that first week was a household run with considerable competence and almost no comfort. The supplies were well organized and adequately stocked, which was Seth's doing, she would learn. The equipment was maintained to a standard that would have satisfied a military quartermaster. The animals were healthy, their feed proportioned correctly, their stalls clean, Arlo's domain evident in the careful attention to small details that larger operations often overlooked. The books in the front room had been read. The tools in the forge had been used until they were extensions of the hands that held them. But the curtains in the kitchen had not been replaced since they were first hung, and they were faded past their original color. The table had never been set with anything beyond the minimum required. There were no flowers dried or otherwise in any room of the house, which in October was not remarkable, but the absence of the hooks or vases that would have held them told her that flowers had not been part of this house for some time. The front porch had 2 chairs and a view of the ridge that on clear mornings was extraordinary, and no one had sat in those chairs in long enough that the wood had darkened unevenly under the elements. The house worked. It did not quite live. On the 4th morning, when the cold had moved from seasonal to serious overnight, she was building the fire when she heard the particular quality of creak that meant weight on the 2nd step of the stair. Not the 3rd or the 4th, which were the ones that announced most people. The 2nd step, which required a deliberate shortening of stride to land on it, which meant the person descending had learned to land there intentionally. Elias came into the kitchen carrying his boots in his left hand and stopped when he saw her at the stove. She did not turn around. "Coffee is nearly ready," she said. He sat and pulled his boots on in silence. When she turned with the cups, he was looking at the window where the pre-dawn dark still held the glass completely. She set his cup beside his hand and sat across from him and drank her own, and neither of them spoke, and the silence was of a particular quality she had not experienced in this house before. Not uncomfortable, not waiting for something, simply present the way the cold outside was present as a condition rather than a problem. After some minutes, Elias said, "The north pasture fence will need work before the hard freeze." "The account books show you purchased wire last September," Clara said. "It's in the south storage shed, 3rd shelf." He looked at her then. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. "I know where I put it," he said. "I know you do," she said. "I was telling you I know where it is too." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he finished his coffee and stood and took his coat from the peg and went out. The 2 chairs on the porch. The next morning, without discussing it, they were both there before sunrise. She began to understand the house through those mornings. Not what she was told about it, but what the house itself told her in the language of its objects and its silences, in the small daily evidence of who these three men were when no one was watching. Seth, she understood through his hands. He arrived at the forge before light and worked until dark with a concentration so complete that it excluded awareness of everything not directly related to the task in front of him. She brought his midday meal to the forge 3 times before he acknowledged it verbally, and when he did acknowledge it, his thanks was functional. A nod, a brief direct look, a return to work. But the 4th time she brought it, the anvil was positioned differently than it had been the previous week, moved 6 inches to the left. And when she set the tray on the workbench, she understood that he had moved it because the original position had required her to reach across the hot metal to set the tray down, which she had done 3 times without comment. He had watched her do it 3 times before he changed anything. She stood in the forge doorway on a Tuesday and watched him work a piece of iron through a sequence of operations: hammer and heat and water, and hammer again, and the rhythm of it was as precise as music. And she understood that this was a man for whom precision was not a professional requirement, but an emotional one, a way of imposing order on a world that had not always permitted it. "How long have you been in doing this?" she asked. "Since I was 12, he said without stopping. "Your father taught you on. He taught me enough to start. The rest I worked out." She nodded and went back to the house and thought about what it meant to teach herself something that mattered, starting from an insufficient foundation and continuing until the foundation was no longer the point. She found the scar on his right forearm by accident on a day when he came into the kitchen for water and rolled up his sleeve to wash his hands, and she was at the table with the account books and looked up at the wrong moment, or the right moment. It ran from the inner wrist halfway to the elbow, old enough to be white, and settled the kind of scar that comes from something moving very fast across the skin. She did not ask about it. He caught her looking and did not say anything. He dried his hands and went back outside. But that evening at supper, he passed the bread to her before she had to reach for it, and she understood this was not unrelated. Arlo was easier to read and harder to know, which was an unusual combination. He was present in the way that people who are waiting for something are present, fully alert, but not quite settled, occupying the space he was in while watching the edges of it for what might come. He talked more than his brothers in the way that people talk when they are using words to manage the distance between themselves and something they are thinking about. On the 6th day in the chugging cold of the corrals, she watched him work with the horses and understood something she had not understood from the forge or the account books or the kitchen table. He moved among the animals with a kind of ease that was not confidence exactly, but intimacy, the ease of someone who has spent so much time in one kind of a relationship that its grammar has become his own. She leaned on the fence rail and watched. "You're the one who read the Marshfield files," she said. Not a question. He did not stop what he was doing. "All of them," he said. "There were 37 applicants. And you chose me. I found you in the files." Elias made the final decision. "On your recommendation." A pause. He was running his hands along a young horse's near foreleg, checking something. "On my recommendation," he agreed. "Why?" Claire asked. He stood up and looked at her over the horse's back, and for a moment the careful management of distance fell away. And she saw something unguarded in his face, something that belonged to the person behind the management. "You wrote that you wanted to live somewhere your work had real consequences," he said. "Most of the other letters talked about wanting a fresh start or a husband or a home. Yours talked about consequences, about wanting your choices to matter in ways you could see." He paused. "I'd never read anything like that in those files before." Clara looked at him steadily. "The letter you sent was not written by Elias." His jaw tightened slightly. "Elias signed the contract." "He signed the contract. He did not describe the morning light on the north face of the ridge." She held his gaze. "The letter had a different ink pressure. The vocabulary was different. You write with more feeling than your brother." The horse moved and Arlo turned back to it, and when he spoke again, his voice was carefully reconstructed. "The contract needed his name. He's the primary holder. Any legal arrangement goes through him." I understand that, Clara said. I'm not questioning the arrangement. I'm telling you that I know who actually reached out to Marshfield and why. She waited a moment. I think it was important for you that I know. He did not deny it. He did not confirm it, but the set of his shoulders changed very slightly, like a man who has been carrying something at an angle for a long time and has just been permitted to shift the weight. She left him with the horses and walked back to the house with the cold pressing at her cheeks and the particular feeling of having reached the first solid ground in a landscape that had been entirely water. On the seventh morning, Seth came into the kitchen while she was reviewing the monthly supply accounts and set a mug of coffee beside her hand without being asked. Having apparently and without announcement decided to take over one of her habitual tasks and said, "You've reorganized the storage rotation." By expiration date and frequency of use, Clara said without looking up, you were losing roughly a fifth of your monthly supplies of spoilage. He stood beside the table for a moment. Where did you learn that? My father managed the Athenaeum's archives the same way. The principle is identical. Seth pulled out the chair across from her and sat, which was unusual enough that she looked up. He was looking at the account book, not at her. The waste in the stores has been a problem for years, he said. It's solved now, Clara said. He nodded once, looking at the page. Then after a moment, it's not a bad system. From Seth Calloway in that first week, this was a significant statement. She was beginning to understand the grammar of this house. The second week brought the first serious cold and the first serious test. It arrived in the form of a conversation Clara initiated herself, which she had been planning since she signed the contract, but had waited to begin until she understood the terrain. She waited until a morning when all three brothers were in or near the house, which happened on Sundays when the weather made outdoor work impractical. She set the account book on the kitchen table open to the page she had prepared and said, I want to understand the land dispute. The quality of silence that followed was different from the usual silences of this house. It had a specificity to it, a compression like air in a space that has become suddenly smaller. Elias looked at the book. Seth looked at his brother. Arlo looked at Clara. Where did you find information about a land dispute? Elias asked. The territorial records I reviewed before leaving Boston noted a legal filing by Dole and Associates Timber Company against Callaway Ridge in 1871 and a second filing in 1873. Both are still active. She kept her voice even informational, the voice her father had used when delivering facts that other people found inconvenient. Reverend Dole is not primarily a clergyman. He is primarily a business partner of a timber concern operating out of Helena. The 400 acres of northern ridge above your upper pasture contain the densest ponderosa stands in this valley. A timber company would find that acreage considerably valuable. The silence extended. Elias, Seth said finally. Elias looked at Clara for a long time. Then he said, the Territorial Land Act of 1872 created a provision that allows commercial entities to challenge private homestead claims on the basis of underutilization. Dole's lawyers are arguing that the northern acreage, because it is not under active cattle operation or cultivation, constitutes underutilized land under the terms of the act. He paused. If a homestead has no established household, meaning a legally recognized family unit, the provision becomes harder to contest. The courts have been inconsistent on this point, but the trend in rulings is against single male occupant properties. Clara heard what he was not saying as clearly as what he was saying. A legal marriage, she said, establishes a household. It provides grounds for contesting the underutilization argument. Yes. She looked at the contract on the table, at the one name on it, and then at the three men around her, and the shape of the thing she had been circling since the night she arrived finally became fully visible. She was quiet for a moment that she permitted herself because she had earned it. You could have put this in the letter, she said. Which letter? Elias asked, and she saw him cut a look at Arlo that contained approximately 17 distinct communications compressed into a fraction of a second. The formal letter, she said, giving Arlo the mercy of not pressing it. You could have stated the legal situation directly. Marshfield advised against it, Seth said. They said women wouldn't come if the arrangement was described as primarily a legal instrument. Marshfield was probably right about most women, Clara said. They were wrong about me. She looked at the account book. I would have come anyway. I would have come sooner, in fact, if I had known there was a deadline. She stood and poured herself more coffee and came back to the table and sat down and looked at each of them in turn. What is the timeline for the next legal filing? Spring term, Elias said. March at the earliest, April more likely. Then we have time to build the case. She pulled the account book toward her and turned to the page she had tabbed the night before. The land records show 8 years of continuous cattle operation on the property, including the northern pasture areas. Seth, you said you've been harvesting timber from the North Ridge selectively for ranch maintenance. Since 1866, Seth said, there will be receipts, orders, records of the lumber used in construction and repair. There will, he said. Those constitute commercial use of the acreage, Clara said. Combined with the grazing records in the original 1864 homestead registration, it builds a continuous use argument. She paused. The problem is that Dole will have a lawyer who knows how to make a judge look at the gaps in the record rather than the continuity. We need to make the continuity impossible to overlook. She was aware that all three of them were looking at her with varying degrees of an expression she did not know how to categorize. You researched territorial land law, Arlo said. I researched everything available to me in the Boston Athenaeum before I bought my train ticket, Clara said. I told Mr. Calloway on my first morning here that I expected honesty. I applied the same standard to myself. Elias was quiet for a moment, then in a voice that was entirely controlled and therefore revealed more than he intended, most women in your position would not have been looking for land disputes in the Territorial Record Office. Most women in my position, Clara said, did not grow up cataloging the Athenaeum's legal history collection. The corner of his mouth moved again, that almost movement that was not quite a smile. No, he said, I don't suppose they did. After that Sunday, something shifted in the particular gravity of the house. Not dramatically, not in any way that it could have been pointed to and named, but in the accumulated small ways that real change always announces itself. Elias began leaving the account books accessible not on the kitchen table, but on the desk in the front room, which was where he actually worked, which meant he was not leaving them for her to find so much as inviting her into the space where the work actually happened. Seth began speaking more, not extensively, not outside his own essential nature, but fractionally more. And what he said had a quality of address to it, now the sentences oriented toward her rather than simply occurring in her vicinity. Arlo remained Arlo, which was to say, present warm beneath the careful management alert to everything. But the alertness had changed in character. It was less the alertness of someone watching to see whether a threat would materialize, and more the alertness of someone watching because what was happening was genuinely interesting to him. The third week ended, and the fourth began, and the cold settled in seriously, the kind of cold that stopped pretending to be seasonal and began announcing itself as a condition of the landscape. And then the room opened, not by design, not by any plan she had formed or any opportunity she had engineered. She was changing sheets on the beds of the 2 empty second-floor rooms, a task she had undertaken because clean bedding in unused rooms cost nothing and signified care for a space that deserved it when she found the key. It was on the floor of the hallway against the baseboard below the coat hooks, half hidden under the edge of the rug runner. It was a padlock key, the shape immediately recognizable from the lock she had seen at the end of the hall, and it had clearly fallen from a coat pocket, probably that morning. Probably Elias's coat, which had been hung and taken down and rehung several times already that day. She stood with the key in her hand. She had a choice. She could put the key on the kitchen table where Elias would find it and know it had been found. She could knock on his study door and hand it to him directly. She could put it back on the floor where she had found it and say nothing. Or she could use it. She was her father's daughter. She believed in information as the only honest foundation for any decision of consequence. She had been in this house for 3 weeks, and she had learned a great deal. But the locked room at the end of the hall was the one thing in this house she had not yet been permitted to understand. And she was beginning to believe that she could not fully understand the three men who lived here, or the weight the house carried, or what she was being asked to share without understanding what lay behind that door. She walked to the end of the hall. She put the key in the lock. She opened the door. The room was small, smaller than the others, with a single window facing north that admitted a flat, even light. It was not dusty. Someone came in here often enough to prevent the particular accumulation of neglect that would have been the most common outcome. The floor was swept. The single rug was not faded at the center from foot traffic in the way that the other room's rugs were faded. A dressing table with a mirror. A brush set in silver still carrying the particular patina of objects that have been handled for years. A pitcher and basin on the washstand. A wardrobe standing open just enough to show that it held clothing, women's clothing hung in orderly rows on wooden pegs, dresses and skirts and two good coats. Not stored. Hung. Hung in the way that clothing is hung by someone who expects to return to it. On the bed, a single pillow in a white case. On the pillow, a small leather book. Clara crossed the room and picked it up. The cover was plain and the pages were edged in brown from age, and the handwriting inside was the handwriting of a young person who had learned to write carefully and was beginning to find her own speed within that carefulness. The Journal of Margaret Elaine Calloway. She opened to the first page and read the date, April 1869. She read 3 pages standing in the middle of the small room with the flat northern light coming through the window, and what she read was the voice of a girl of 17 who loved the mountains and the horses, and her 3 brothers with a completeness that had not yet learned to be anything other than total. She read 3 brothers who are each their own kind of impossible, and I wouldn't trade a single one of them for all the easier brothers in the world. She read the horses know. When it's coming, Arlo taught me that. She turned to the final entry, November 14th, 1869. The handwriting was slightly less careful than the earlier pages, hurried perhaps, or written in poor light. The storm is coming. You can feel it changing the air, the way metal changes in the forge just before it takes on shape. Elias said I shouldn't go out. We argued about it properly, argued which we don't often do, and I said the things I didn't quite mean, and he said things he didn't quite mean either, because that's what arguments are. Blizzard said to be bad, but my horse is still out on the north slope, and I know that pasture. The sentence ended, not with a period, not with a dash, simply ended mid-thought in the middle of a word, in the way that a life ends. Clara stood very still for a long time. She heard the stare. She put the journal back on the pillow. She crossed the room, stepped out, and pulled the door closed behind her. She had the key in her hand, and she was in the hallway 2 steps from the closed door when Elias reached the top of the stair. He stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her, then at the door, then at the key in her hand. She walked to him and placed the key in his hand. She held it there for a moment the way you hold something fragile before transferring it. It fell from your coat, she said quietly, near the hooks downstairs. His hand closed around it. The muscle along his jaw worked once. His eyes, when they came back to her face, had in them something she had seen in her father's face in the last years of his life. The specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something for so long that he has lost the ability to imagine putting it down. It was my sister, he said. His voice was entirely flat, the flatness of a man who has spoken this sentence so many times inside his own head that the words have become structural rather than emotional. I know, Clara said. She let a moment pass. She was 17, he said. I know, she said again. She did not tell him she had opened the journal. She did not need to. Some information served no purpose except to make the person holding it feel less culpable, and she was not interested in her own absolution at his expense. Every woman who has come here before, he said, found that room and left. I found the room, Clara said. I'm still here. He looked at her for a long time. Then he stepped past her and put the key in the lock and turned it, and the padlock clicked closed, and he put the key in his chest pocket where it would not fall again. He went back downstairs. Clara stood in the hallway alone and listened to the house settle around her in the cold and thought about what it meant to lock a door, not because you wanted to keep the room hidden, but because you were not yet ready for it to be open. About the difference between concealment and grief. About her father who had locked his own version of this room and kept the key on him always, and what that locking had cost him across 17 years. She went back to her own room and sat at her desk and did not write anything. But she thought with a clarity that felt new about the difference between arriving somewhere and choosing to stay. She had arrived. The first part was finished. The choosing had not yet begun. And then 4 days later, the Reverend came back. This time he brought a lawyer. The man's name was Aldous Price, and he was from Helena, and he wore city clothes in a way that announced he had traveled specifically to wear them here. And he carried a leather satchel that had the look of a document case rather than a traveling bag. He and Dole arrived together in the late morning when the sky had gone the particular white of impending weather and the cold had a vertical quality to it pressing down. Elias came to the porch. Seth appeared from the forge. Arlo came from the corrals, and Clara noted that all three of them had positioned themselves in a loose triangle before she had finished pulling her coat on, which told her this was not the first time they had prepared this formation. She came out and stood slightly to the side of Elias, not behind him. Price produced a document from the satchel and presented it with the efficiency of a man who had presented documents in unwelcoming situations before and had learned to make the motion so routine it was difficult to object to. The document was a formal legal notice. Clara read it over Elias's shoulder without appearing to lean in, which was a skill she had developed in her father's library when she was 9. Its substance pursuant to Territorial Land Act provisions regarding household composition and homestead validity, Clara Whitfield's presence at Callaway Ridge was legally indeterminate without documented marital status, and any legal protection she might extend to the property through her presence was therefore contestable unless formalized within 48 hours. It was, she recognized, an extremely precise piece of legal harassment. The provision it cited existed. The timeline it demanded was not technically illegal. The entire thing was designed not to win a case in court but to force a decision before one was ready to be made. She looked at Dole. He was looking at her with the same smile he always carried, and behind the smile was the same calculation, and beneath the calculation was something she had not seen clearly before, a confidence that came from having done this particular thing before and watched it work. 48 hours, Elias said. The law is clear on this point, Price said. Elias folded the document. You'll have your answer before then? Dole turned his smile to Clara one more time. Mrs. Callaway, I do hope this situation resolves comfortably for you. Our community is a welcoming one, particularly for women who find themselves in uncertain circumstances. He let the word uncertain do its work. Remember that our doors remain open. The carriage left. Clara stood on the porch in the cold long after it had disappeared down the trail, reading the shapes in the hard-packed yard where the carriage wheels had turned the way the horses' hooves had churned the frozen mud. She felt Elias beside her, not looking at her, looking at the same place she was looking. This is why you advertised, she said, not an accusation, a confirmation. Yes, he said, the legal exposure is real. Yes. The acreage above the north pasture. Yes. She turned and looked at him directly. He turned and looked at her directly. This was becoming their way of things. The direct look held until something true passed between them that words would have made clumsy. There are 2 ways to respond to this document, Clara said. We could engage Price's legal argument through proper channels, which would take months and would leave the property exposed in the meantime. Or we could remove the grounds for the argument entirely. The second option requires a formal marriage registered with the county. I know what it requires. Another moment, the wind had picked up along the ridge and was moving through the pine stands with a sound like running water. I am not in the habit of making decisions under artificial deadline, Clara said. But I am also practical enough to understand when a decision that was going to be made eventually needs to be made now. She paused. I came here to stay. The contract I signed reflects that intention. The formalization of that contract through a legal marriage changes the paperwork, not the substance. Elias was quiet. I will not pretend it changes more than it changes, she continued. I won't perform certainty I haven't earned, but I will also not pretend it's a sacrifice because it isn't one. She met his eyes. Is it something you are willing to do? The answer came without hesitation, which told her more than the words themselves. Yes, he said. Seth organized the practical arrangements that afternoon with the efficiency of a man who had been a logistics problem solver his entire life. Agnes Purcell reached by the man Seth sent into town before the light went sent back, word that Reverend Williams at the Presbyterian Church would be available the following morning at 9. That evening, Arlo came to her room door. He knocked quietly, and when she opened it, he was holding something wrapped in brown paper tied with thin cord. He held it out without ceremony. I had Agnes help with the measurement, he said. A few weeks ago, she unwrapped it. Riding gloves made of butter-soft leather lined with wool, the stitching at the seams done by someone who knew what they were doing. She held them in her hands and felt the weight of the weeks of preparation contained in them, the advanced planning, the specific attention to size, the decision made well before Dole's lawyer ever appeared with his document. These were already made, she said. Yes, Arlo said. She looked up at him. You were confident I would stay. I was hopeful, he said, and the honest simplicity of it, the complete absence of strategy in it, was so unlike the careful management he usually maintained that she understood she was seeing him directly, possibly for the first time. Thank you, she said. She was putting the gloves on the table when Seth appeared in the doorway behind Arlo. He held out her traveling coat, the one she had worn from Boston. The button that had been loose for 6 months, the one she had been managing with the particular patience of someone who had more important things to attend to, had been replaced. Not simply resecured. Replaced with a button that matched the remaining 3 exactly, which was not a coincidence, but a project, a specific and considered act of attention toward an object that was hers. She took the coat and held it and did not say anything for a moment. The button was loose since I left Boston, she said. I know, Seth said. It needed to be fixed. He went downstairs. She stood in her room holding the coat and the gloves and understood with the clear and unambiguous certainty that her father had taught her to recognize when it arrived, that she had found a place where the work she did would have real consequences. The marriage took place the following morning at 9. Reverend Williams was brief and competent. Agnes Purcell stood as witness and held herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had wanted this particular outcome for longer than the event itself warranted. The church was cold, and the light through its plain windows was the clean winter light of late October, and when Reverend Williams asked the formal question, and Elias said the formal words, the words were said in a voice that was exactly what Clara had come to understand as his voice, entirely without ornament, completely without performance, carrying precisely and only what it meant. His hand was warm when she took it. Steady, a working man's hand. She said her own words clearly, looking at him. On the way back up the mountain, they rode in silence for a long time. The sky had opened slightly to the south, and a band of clean blue showed above the lower ridges, and the horses moved well on the frozen trail, and the cold was the honest cold of a place that did not apologize for what it was. I want to say something, Elias said. She waited. I told you on the first morning that the previous women left because the house was too heavy. He was looking at the road ahead. What I didn't tell you is that the weight is mine as much as it is the house's. The room at the end of the hall is locked because I put the lock on it. Nobody else did that. Clara was quiet, letting him continue at his own pace. I argued with her, he said. Margaret, that evening. She wanted to go out for the horse, and I told her not to, and it became a real argument, the kind we almost never had, and she went out anyway. He paused. By the time I went after her, the storm was too strong to find her in. He stopped there. Clara understood he had reached the edge of what he was able to say on this road on this day. She did not press further. You went in after her, she said. Not fast enough. You went in, she said again. He did not respond. Elias. She waited until he looked at her. You went into a blizzard after your 17-year-old sister because she ran out in anger over an argument that neither of you started to have in order to hurt each other. She held his gaze. The argument was the weather. The storm was the storm. Those are not the same thing. He looked away. You've been paying for the weather for 5 years, she said. That's not a reasonable debt. The horses moved on the trail. The pine shadows crossed the road in their regular intervals. Somewhere above the ridge, a hawk moved in a long, slow curve across the blue window in the clouds. My father, Clara said after a while, spent 17 years locked in the room where my mother died. Not literally, but the room was always there inside him, and the door was always closed, and he paid for it in every ordinary day he could have had and didn't. She paused. He died in April. I came here in October. I had 6 months between those two things to think about what it costs to keep a room locked. Elias was silent. They rode the rest of the way in the silence of people who have said something true and are letting it settle into the ground before expecting anything to grow from it. Back at the ranch, Seth was waiting on the porch with the particular quality of stillness that meant he had been standing there for some time and had not wanted to look like it. He looked at both of them in his direct, structural way. Then he went inside without speaking, and shortly afterward, the smell of something serious being cooked came through the kitchen window, which was how Seth Calloway marked occasions he did not know how to name. That evening after supper, when the lamplight was warm and the stove was doing its work against the dark cold outside, Elias set the land record books and the account ledgers on the kitchen table and sat down across from Clara and pushed them toward her. Not left them on a desk for her to find. Pushed them across the table directly. She looked at them, then at him. You said you knew the land laws, he said. I do. Then let's build the case, he said, before the spring filing. She pulled the books toward her and opened the first one and found the tab she had put there the week before, the one marking the beginning of 8 years of continuous operational records. And the work began in the lamplight, the two of them across the table from each other and outside the window. The first snow of the season began to fall quietly without announcement, as if it had been waiting for the right moment. She had come here to stay. She had stayed. The rest was a matter of what staying fully and without reservation would require of both of them. She was not afraid of the answer. The first snow fell on a Wednesday and did not stop until Friday. By the time it ended, Copper Falls had disappeared from the visible world entirely, and Calloway Ridge existed as a self-contained universe of white and gray, and the orange light of fires kept burning around the clock against the cold that pressed through every seam in the timber walls. The temperature dropped to the kind of number that stopped being descriptive and became instead a physical condition, something you moved through rather than measured. Clara learned the ranch in that blizzard the way you learn a person during a crisis, quickly, completely, and without the softening that ordinary circumstances permit. She learned that Seth woke before 3 in the morning to check the animal temperatures in the barn every night, without being asked, without mentioning it. She learned that Arlo read to the horses when the weather kept them confined, not in a self-conscious way, but practically the way another man might whistle, as though the sound itself was the point and the audience was incidental. She learned that Elias did not sleep well when the wind was from the north, and that he managed this by sitting in the kitchen in the dark hours with coffee he did not always drink, and that if she came down during those hours and built the fire back up and sat across from him, he did not leave. She learned in the way you learn things that matter that she was not afraid of the winter. The practical work of the weeks that followed had a quality she had not experienced before in her life, a quality she eventually identified as consequence. Every task she completed had a visible result. Every decision she made about the household accounts, or the supply rotation, or the management of the feed stores showed up within days or weeks in the running of the operation. She was not performing competence for an audience. She was exercising it in a place where it was genuinely needed, and the difference between those two things was larger than she had understood it to be when she wrote those words in her Marshfield application. She worked alongside these 3 men, and the work built something between them that was not yet the thing it would eventually become, but was already more than the thing it had been when she arrived. And then on a Tuesday in November, 6 weeks after the wedding, Agnes Purcell climbed the mountain road in weather that she would not have climbed it in under ordinary circumstances, and she was carrying a letter. The envelope had been addressed to Mrs. E. Calloway at the Copper Falls Post Office. The return address said M. Marshfield, Boston, Massachusetts. Agnes had recognized the Marshfield name from the original correspondence and had made the trip herself rather than send it with the weekly supply run because she had looked at the envelope long enough to notice that the handwriting on it was not the handwriting she remembered from the original agency correspondence. She gave it to Clara at the kitchen door with a look that communicated, "I don't know what this is, but I thought you should have it," before anyone else made a decision about it. Clara opened it at the kitchen table with all three brothers present, which was her choice made deliberately. The letter was brief. It stated that the Marshfield agency had received an inquiry regarding potential irregularities in Clara's application, specifically a question about prior marital status, and that the agency was bound to inform her that the inquiry had referenced what it described as a Suffolk County record of an earlier marriage contracted in Boston in 1871. The letter did not name a source. It did not provide documentation. It asked her to respond at her earliest convenience. Clara read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table and looked at it as she looked at any document that required analysis without rushing, without the interference of the reaction she was also having, which was a cold and clarifying anger she set aside to deal with later. Agnes was watching her. Elias was watching the letter. Seth had crossed his arms and was looking at the wall above the window with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head that had nothing to do with numbers. Arlo said quietly, "Dole." "Yes," Clara said. "You've never been married before," Elias said. It was not a question. She looked at him. "No." He nodded once with the directness of a man who has decided something and is done with the deciding. "Then this is a document designed to create doubt rather than establish fact." "That's what it is," Clara said, "and it's well-timed. The spring legal filing is 4 months away. If this inquiry reaches the county clerk's records before we can contest it, it introduces grounds for questioning the validity of our marriage registration, which removes the household protections," Seth said from behind his crossed arms. "Yes." Agnes set her coffee cup down. "Hiram Dole has a business partner in Helena who has connections to the Boston legal community. He's used similar tactics in 2 other property disputes in this valley in the past 7 years. Both times the property changed hands." Clara thought about this for a moment. She thought about Dorian Fitch, who had been 3 years ahead of Arlo at the Territorial School in Helena before going east to study law, and who was now, according to the last letter Arlo had received from him, a clerk at the Suffolk County Courthouse in Boston. She looked at Arlo. He was already reaching for paper. "Dorian can pull the Suffolk County records," he said. "If there's no prior marriage on file under your name, he can get a certified copy of the absence of record," which is the documentary version of a denial, Clara said, admissible in territorial court. "And we need the source of the inquiry," Seth said. "If we can prove the inquiry itself was manufactured, the letter becomes evidence against Dole rather than against us." "The envelope," Clara said and turned it over. The return address was printed not handwritten, which was unusual for personal correspondence. The paper was good quality, better than a private individual typically used. The postmark was Boston, but the stamping was from a business post office station rather than a residential collection point. She set it carefully back on the table. "Someone in Boston printed this envelope on commercial equipment and sent it from a business address," she said. "Someone with access to commercial printing services in a Boston business address." Agnes said, "Dole's Timber Company has a Boston correspondent. They handle the Eastern financing." "Dole and Associates Timber Company," Clara said, and looked at each of them in turn. "We need to establish the connection between this letter and that company. If we can document that a forged inquiry originated from a business entity directly connected to the party contesting our land claim, we change the nature of the case entirely." Elias was watching her with the quality of attention he gave to things that mattered. We document it, he said. How? I write to Dorian Fitch tonight, Arlo said. I ask him to pull the records and to check the Boston Business Registry for the address on this postmark. I contact the Helena Land Office, Seth said. I know the clerk. He'll tell me whether there's been any recent inquiries made about this property under Dole's company name. And Clara said, will begin organizing the continuous use documentation for the northern acreage into a form that a territorial court cannot reasonably dismiss. She looked at the letter on the table one more time. Dole is not trying to win this case legally. He's trying to make it expensive and uncertain enough that we settle rather than fight. The response is to make the case so clear that settlement looks worse than defeat. Elias said, you've done this before. I've watched my father spend 20 years acquiring and organizing information that other people used to do exactly this kind of work, Clara said. I've never done it myself, but I know how it's done. He looked at her for a long moment. So do we, he said. That night, 4 people sat around the kitchen table and built a case. Arlo wrote his letter to Dorian Fitch in the focused, pressured hand that Clara had learned to recognize as his working voice, not the careful public version, but the private one, where the words came faster than the management could keep up with them. Seth produced from the storage room a box of receipts and records going back to 1864 that he had kept with the particular thoroughness of a man who trusted paper more than memory. Elias spread the land maps across the end of the table and marked every fence line, every watering point, every section of the northern acreage that had been used in documented ranch operations over 8 years. Clara took everything they produced and began building the organizational structure that would make it impossible for a territorial court to look at the gaps rather than the continuity. She worked past midnight. When she looked up, Elias was still there. You should sleep, she said. You're still working, he said. I work late. I've noticed. She looked at him across the table, across the spread of maps and receipts, and the letter from Dorian Fitch that did not yet exist but would. The lamp between them threw his face into the warm contrast of working light, and she thought not for the first time that this was a man whose face was more honest in specific conditions than in the general light of day, as though the ordinary brightness of things gave him too many ways to be opaque, and the particular intimacy of lamplight in a late kitchen removed them. Elias, she said. He waited. The room at the end of the hall. He was still. I'm not asking you to open it, she said. I'm asking you to consider that what's behind it doesn't require darkness to be honored. She chose her words carefully. Keeping it locked doesn't protect what's in it. It just keeps the rest of the house from having access to what it meant. The silence that followed was the deepest kind, the kind that is not waiting to speak, but is actually listening to something. She would have been 22 this year when he said, I know. Same age as you, nearly. I know. He was quiet for a long time. The fire cracked in the stove. Outside, the wind moved through the pine stands with its running water sound. The lamp held steady. After a long time, Elias reached across the table and picked up the land map that was closest to her and moved it to his side and continued the work they had both been doing, and neither of them said anything more about it that night. But something had moved in the deep structure of the house, the way bedrock moves in the spring thaw, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a direction it would not reverse. The blizzard that came in the second week of December arrived without adequate warning, which was not unusual for that elevation in that time of year, but the speed of it was. One morning the sky was merely overcast. By midday, the wind had changed direction twice. By 2 in the afternoon, visibility had dropped to the length of a man's arm. Seth and Elias were on the east boundary, checking fence line when it hit. They turned back immediately and made the ranch house with the practiced efficiency of men who had navigated this terrain in exactly this kind of weather many times before. Arlo had gone to the north pasture. Clara was at the kitchen table with the account books when Elias came through the door, and she knew from the set of his face before he said anything. How long, she asked. 2 hours, maybe more. He was already pulling a rope from the hook by the door. Clara stood and put on her coat. No, he said. You need someone to hold the line when the gusts come, she said. One person cannot manage the rope and search at the same time. You know that. He looked at her. This was the look she had come to understand as his final evaluation, the one he gave to things that mattered before he committed to them. Stay behind me, he said. Do not let go of the rope under any circumstances. They found Arlo under the largest ponderosa on the north slope, in the shelter of its downwind side, sitting with his back against the trunk and his right leg extended in front of him at the angle of a man who has learned not to move it. His horse had come down on ice, and Arlo had gone with it. The ankle was not broken cleanly, but it was bad enough. Elias got his brother upright and took his weight across his shoulders. Clara held the guide rope taut and walked them back through the white erasure of the storm one step at a time, calling out direction when the wind dropped enough for her voice to carry. Midway back, a gust hit them broadside with the particular malice of wind that has been building across open terrain. Clara's footing went. She caught herself on the rope, but the rope swung wide, and for a moment there was nothing between her and the white noise of the storm. Elias's hand found her wrist. He could not see her. He simply reached in the direction she had been, and his hand found her wrist and held it Arlo still across his other shoulder, and he did not let go until she had her footing back. They did not speak of it. There was nothing to say that the grip itself had not already said. Seth was at the kitchen door when they came out of the white. He took Arlo's other side without being asked. Inside by the stove, while Clara boiled water for the poultice, and Seth splinted the ankle with the quiet expertise of a man who had dealt with ranch injuries his entire adult life, Arlo looked up at her from the floor where they had settled him and said, "You went out." "Yes," she said. "You didn't have to." She looked at him steadily. "I know." Over the following days, while Arlo recovered on the cot near the kitchen stove, the fever that came with the injury loosened something in him the way fevers sometimes do, burning away the careful management he usually maintained and leaving behind the person underneath it. He talked more than he normally permitted himself to talk. He talked about the horses and about the ranch and about the years before Clara had come, and eventually on the third evening, he talked about Margaret. Not as biography, as a memory. The way a person talks about someone they miss so specifically that the words themselves become a form of presence. She was the only one who sang, he said. In the house, I mean. She'd sing while she worked and not even realize she was doing it. After she was gone, the house went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. He looked at the ceiling. I don't think Elias has forgiven himself for the argument. I know he hasn't, Claire said. He went in after her, in the blizzard. He went in the moment he realized she'd gone out. Arlo was quiet for a moment. What he hasn't told you is what the argument was about, not just the horse, what he actually said to her. Clara waited. He told her the horse wasn't worth her life. Arlo's voice was careful and low. Those were the words he used. He said it was just an animal. And Margaret looked at him the way she looked at people when they disappointed her, which wasn't often, because it took a great deal to disappoint her, and then she went outside to prove that she disagreed. He paused. Elias has been carrying those exact words for 5 years. He thinks they sent her out into the storm. He thinks that if he'd said something different, she would have stayed inside and argued with him instead. Clara was quiet for a long time. She wouldn't have, she said finally. Arlo looked at her. I read 3 pages of her journal, Clara said. 3 pages written by a girl who loved her brothers without condition or reservation. That girl did not go out into a blizzard because of words someone said to her. She went out because she was 17 years old and she loved her horse and she believed she knew that pasture better than the storm did. She paused. Those are not Elias's words. That is who Margaret was. Arlo was quiet for a long time. Then he said, he needs to hear that. I know, Clara said, but he needs to be ready to hear it. That's not the same thing. The response from Dorian Fitch arrived in the second week of December ahead of schedule, which told them something about how seriously Arlo had written the request. Fitch had pulled every record under Clara's name in Suffolk County going back 15 years. There was no prior marriage. There was no record of any inquiry about a prior marriage having been made by any authorized legal party. There was, however, a record of a request for information about the Suffolk County Marriage Registry made in October 1874 from a Boston business address, a request logged under the name of a correspondence firm retained by a Montana-based timber concern. Clara read the document twice, as was her practice. Then she set it on the table and looked at it for a moment, and what she felt was not satisfaction exactly, but the particular clean feeling that comes when a thing you have suspected turns out to be exactly what you suspected, neither worse nor better, just confirmed. Seth had returned from Helena 2 days earlier with information from the county land clerk. A formal inquiry about the Callaway Ridge deed status had been filed under the name Dole and Associates Timber Company in November 1874, citing as one of its grounds a question about the validity of the current household registration. They had what they needed. Arlo laid it out on the table that evening. The manufactured inquiry originated from a business address connected to a correspondence firm retained by Dole's company. The timing placed it squarely within the legal maneuvering around the spring filing. The Fitch document proved no prior marriage existed. The land clerk's record proved the inquiry was part of Dole's formal legal strategy rather than an independent concern. "We take this to the spring term," Clara said. "We take it further," Seth said. She looked at him. "Dole didn't just file a land claim," Seth said. "He manufactured evidence and submitted it through a legal channel as part of an active territorial court proceeding. That's a different category of thing." "It's fraud," Arlo said. "It's fraud on a territorial court proceeding," Seth said. "That is a criminal matter, not a civil one." Clara thought about this carefully. She thought about the nature of leverage, which her father had explained to her once as the difference between having something and being willing to use it. She thought about Dole's smile, the way it was always exactly the same, and what the sameness of it communicated about a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. "We don't take it to the court," she said. They all looked at her. "Not yet. Not as a criminal filing." She looked at the documents on the table. "We take it to Dole directly. First." The fire in the forge came 4 nights later. Clara woke to the smell before she heard anything, the specific sharpness of burning pine resin that was different from the wood smoke smell of the stove, wilder and less contained, and she was at the window before she was fully conscious. The forge building was burning. The fire had taken the south wall first and was moving with the particular enthusiasm of fire that has been given more than nature provided. The dry wood of the storage lean-to attached to the forge was involved, and the light of it threw the yard into a jumping orange clarity that was terrible in its beauty. She pulled on her boots and her coat and was on the stairs before she heard the others already moving below her. Arlo had been the first out, she would learn later, roused by the horses who had known before any human instrument could have measured it. He had woken Elias and Seth and been at the barn before the main structure caught, and despite his ankle, which had not yet fully healed, he had gotten 3 of the 4 horses out of the near stalls before the crossbeam above the barn door cracked and shifted. Clara reached the yard to find Seth at the water trough with buckets and Elias running from the barn with Arlo's weight across his shoulders, Arlo's arm around his neck, the 2 of them moving with the ungainly, coordinated speed of men who have made each other's safety a physical reflex. She went to the water trough without being directed and began passing buckets to Seth, and the 2 of them worked the fire until the forge building was lost. But the barn was saved, and the 3 horses in the outer corral were safe, and the storage structures on the north side of the yard were untouched. But the forge was gone, and in the barn and the stall, they had not been able to reach the oldest mare on the property had not gotten out. She had been on the ranch since 1867. She had been Margaret's horse. Arlo sat in the snow of the yard with his right arm showing a burn along the forearm where the sleeve had ridden up during the rescue. Not serious, but serious enough to need attention, and he looked at the ruin of the forge building and did not say anything for a long time. Elias sat beside him, not beside him in the way of a man offering comfort at a careful distance, but directly beside him, their shoulders touching, and Clara watched Elias put his arm around his youngest brother and felt something shift in the house's long grief, the way a door shifts on a hinge that has been frozen and has finally been warmed enough to move. Seth stood a few feet away and put his hand on Elias's shoulder, and the three of them stayed that way in the snow and the dying light of the fire for a long time. Clara stood apart and watched and understood that some things are not made better by presence, that some grief has its own right to the space it needs, and she gave them the space. In the morning, Seth found the tracks. On the west side of the property where the fence line met the timber stand, boot prints in the crusted snow, a single set moving in and out. The heel pattern was the particular broad tread pattern of a work boot used by men who spent time on rough terrain, the kind worn by workers in the timber industry. She and Seth looked at the tracks together in the early light. "Harker," Seth said, "Dole's man." Clara nodded. She had been thinking since before dawn about the nature of the decision she was facing. They had enough documentation now to pursue Dole through legal channels. They could build a complete case. They could also end this differently. She thought about what ending it differently would cost. She thought about what it would mean for this family to spend the next 6 months in a territorial court, proceeding during which Dole's lawyers would find every available opportunity to introduce delay and uncertainty and expense. She thought about the men whose names were on the deed and how long they had already been in a fight they had not started. She thought about her father, who had always believed that the proper response to a powerful adversary was the proper channel, and about the fact that the proper channel had not prevented him from dying tired. She made a decision. That evening, she told Elias what she intended to do. He said nothing immediately, which was his way of receiving information he needed to think about. Then he said, "I'll come with you." "No," she said, "I need to do this myself, and I need you to let me." He had looked at her for a long time with the direct holding gaze she had come to understand as his way of taking the full measure of something. "All right," he said. Before she went to sleep that night, Elias knocked on the door frame of the kitchen where she was organizing the documents she would carry. "There's something I should have said more fully," he told her. On the road back from the wedding, she looked up from the papers. "I told you we argued, that she went out anyway." He stood with his hands at his sides in the posture of a man who has rehearsed something and is now delivering it without the rehearsal's protection. "What I didn't tell you was what I said to her. The actual words." He paused. "I told her the horse wasn't worth her life. I told her it was just an animal." Clara was still. She looked at me like I'd said something unforgivable, and then she went outside to prove she didn't agree. His voice was entirely flat, the flatness of something that has been carried too long in too small a space. I've had 5 years to understand that those were the last words she heard from me. Clara set down the papers. "Elias," she said, "she wrote in her journal on that last day that the two of you argued and that you both said things you didn't quite mean." Those are her own words written in her own hand while the argument was still fresh. She held his gaze steadily. "She knew you didn't mean it the way it sounded. She knew exactly what you meant, which was that you were frightened for her. And she went out anyway because she was 17 years old and she loved that horse and she believed she knew that pasture." She paused. "What sent her out was not your words. It was who she was. You have been paying for her character as though it were your fault." The silence that followed was very long. "I went in after her," he said finally. "I know you did. It wasn't fast enough." "You went in," she said, "in a blizzard. You went in immediately." She kept her voice quiet and direct. "That is not the action of a man who meant what he said about an animal not being worth a life. That is the action of a man who would have given his own." Elias stood in the doorway for a long time. Then he came into the kitchen and sat down across from her and looked at the documents spread between them. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the flatness and carried instead the quality of something that has been set down after a very long carry. "Let's finish the case," he said. 2 days before the spring court term, Clara rode down the mountain with Agnes Purcell beside her because Agnes had been in this valley for 28 years and knew every room in Hiram Dole's church building, And because Clara understood the value of a witness who had a long and credible history, the three Calloway brothers waited on the mountain. Dole's church in Copperbarnwish Falls was a modest building of good timber that had been maintained with the care of a man who understood that appearances were foundational. His office was at the back through a hallway that smelled of candle wax and paper. He was at his desk when they were shown in, and his smile was already in place before he looked up from whatever he had been reading. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "what an unexpected pleasure." "Reverend Dole," Claire said. She sat down across from his desk without being invited to sit, which she knew would communicate something about the nature of the visit. Agnes remained standing near the door. She placed the documents on his desk one at a time. The Fitch certification from Suffolk County, no prior marriage under Clara's name, no authorized legal inquiry about such a marriage. The Boston Business Registry records the correspondence firm connected to Dole's Timber Company, operating from the same postal district, the postmark on the manufactured letter. The Helena Land Clerk's record, the November 1874 filing under Dole and Associates, citing questions about the Calloway household registration, timed precisely to the introduction of the manufactured inquiry. Seth's documentation of the tracks on the west fence line with measurements in the heel pattern sketch he had made in the snow alongside a sworn statement from Arlo, identifying the pattern as consistent with work boots worn by Clem Harker on his previous visits to Calloway Ridge. Dole looked at each document as she placed it. His expression did not change. This told her he was either very experienced at concealing response or had been expecting something like this for some time. She suspected both. "These are interesting papers," he said. "They are," Claire agreed. "They document a coordinated attempt to introduce fraudulent evidence into an active territorial court proceeding connected to deliberate destruction of private property." She paused. "In combination, they constitute grounds for a criminal complaint that would be considerably more damaging to a man in your position than a land dispute." He looked at her. "I am not going to file that complaint," she said. His expression shifted very slightly toward a question he was too experienced to ask aloud. "I am not going to file it," Clara said, "because filing it would occupy the next year of our lives and the lives of three men who have been working and building and maintaining this property for a decade while you have been trying to take it from them." She held his gaze steadily. "Instead, I am going to give you these documents and tell you that identical copies exist in three other locations held by people who have instructions to act on them if anything further occurs to inconvenience the Calloway Ridge property or anyone connected to it." She paused. "The spring filing," she said. "You will withdraw it." Dole was quiet. "You can withdraw it on any technical grounds you choose," Clara said. "Procedural error, incomplete documentation. Whatever your lawyers find most convenient. The outcome is what matters, not the language." She looked at him evenly. "You have built something here, Reverend. A church, a community, a reputation. I imagine that building is worth protecting." The silence in the office lasted long enough that Agnes shifted slightly near the door. Then Dole said in a voice that had shed its honey and become simply flat and precise, "You are not what I expected." "No," Clara said. "I don't suppose I am." She stood and straightened her coat and walked out of the office and through the church and into the cold air of the Copper Falls street, and Agnes came behind her, and neither of them spoke until they were on their horses and moving. Then Agnes said, "That was well done." "It was necessary," Clara said. "Those aren't the same thing," Agnes said, "but in this case they happen to coincide." Dole's lawyers filed a withdrawal of the spring petition 3 days later, citing procedural irregularities in the original documentation. The court clerk recorded it without comment. The Calloway Ridge deed remained undisturbed. When Clara came back up the mountain that afternoon, the three brothers were on the porch. Not performing waiting, but genuinely waiting, which was a different posture entirely, and she saw it from the last bend in the trail and understood that the difference between those two things was part of what she was building here. She tied her horse and came up to the porch, and Elias was there. "It's done," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You went alone." I went with Agnes. You went without us. You would have made it about the wrong things, she said not unkindly. It needed to be about the right things. He was quiet. Then Seth came off the porch and stood in front of her with the particular directness he used when he had decided to say something he would not repeat. You stayed, he said. I did, she said. The others didn't. I know. He nodded once, looked at her with the structural certainty of a man who has tested the load-bearing capacity of something and found it adequate and went back to the forge. That evening, Elias came to the door of the locked room. He did not knock. He did not hesitate at the lock the way he usually did. He took the key from his pocket and put it in the padlock and opened the door and stood in the doorway with the hall lamp throwing light into the room that had not had deliberate offered light in 5 years. He stood there for a long time. Then he crossed to the dressing table and picked up the silver brush set and the small hand mirror and carried them downstairs and set them on the mantelpiece above the parlor fireplace, where the light from the fire could reach them and anyone coming into the room could see them. Clara was in the kitchen doorway. She watched him set them on the mantelpiece and stepped back. He stood looking at the silver brush and the small mirror in the firelight. She doesn't need to be kept in the dark, he said, not to Clara specifically, not to the room, perhaps to himself, or perhaps to Margaret, or perhaps simply to the house. She was never that kind of person. Clara did not say anything. That same week, she found 3 of Arlo's sketches on the kitchen table, weighted down by the salt cellar. They were the ones she had seen folded in his book months before Elias at the fence line, Seth at the forge, and a third one she had not seen before, which was the south porch in early morning, with 2 cups on the railing and the ridge behind them. No figures, just the cups and the mountain and the particular quality of light that existed there before anyone else was awake. She looked at it for a long time. She found a frame for it in the storage room that afternoon and hung it in the kitchen and said nothing about it. Arlo noticed. He did not say anything either. But the following week, 2 more appeared on the table, and the week after that, 1 more, and by the end of spring, there were drawings in every room of the house. But later, when the lamp was low and the fire had settled to coals, she sat in the kitchen with her hands around a cup of tea and listened to the house breathe around her, and what she heard was different from what she had heard on the first night. Not heavier, not lighter exactly, but more honestly weighted. A house that was carrying what it carried in the open rather than behind locked doors, and finding that the carrying was in the open more manageable than it had been in the dark. Elias came into the kitchen and sat across from her, the lamp between them, the fire behind him, his face in the particular condition of honesty that the late hours and the specific light produced. He said, "You stayed." "Where would I go?" she said. "Anywhere safer than this." She looked at him. "Safe isn't what I came here for." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, the large calloused hand of a man who had spent 20 years building something he had nearly lost. And she turned her hand under his and held it, and the fire burned down to its coals, and outside the window, the winter stars of Montana hung in the immense dark above the ridge, and neither of them moved for a long time. When morning came, everything had changed between them. Not suddenly, not with drama, but in the way that the season changes so gradually that each individual day is indistinguishable from the last, and then one morning you look up, and everything is different, and you understand it has been moving in this direction for a long time. The spring came to Callaway Ridge the way it always came to high places, reluctantly, and then all at once, the snow retreated from the south slopes first, and then from the corrals, and then from the lower pastures, and the creek that came down from the north ridge ran loud and brown with meltwater. And the horses stood in the first mud of the year, with their faces turned toward the sun in the particular expression of animals that have endured the winter and are choosing consciously or not to notice its end. Clara and Elias stood on the south porch in the early April light, and she showed him the water survey she had been refining since January, the route from the Western Creek tributary that would bring reliable water to the north acreage without requiring the labor-intensive hauling they had been doing for years. He looked at the survey for a long time. "My father thought about this," he said. "I know, you told me. He never had anyone to work it out with." She looked at him. He was looking at the ridge at the north slope, where the last snow was still visible in the deep shadow gullies between the rock faces, and his expression had the quality she had come to recognize as the one he wore when he was considering the future rather than the past. "We should start the channel work in May," she said, "before the summer dry." "Seth can do the planning," he said. "He'll want to. I know he will." Arlo appeared at the corner of the porch and looked up at both of them and said, "The south corral fence held." "Good," Elias said. Arlo went back to his horses. He had rebuilt the south fence himself over the past 3 weeks, working with the focused, healing energy of a person who has been frightened and is converting the fear into something useful. His arm had healed cleanly. He had not spoken again about the fire or about the mare they had lost. But Clara had seen him on a morning in late March stand at the edge of the rebuilt barn and look at the empty stall for a long time before going to work. She had not said anything. Some things needed to be carried by the person they belonged to, and what she could offer was not the carrying but the company. Seth rebuilt the forge in April better than it had been. He designed it differently with a wider working area and better ventilation and a stone foundation that would not be vulnerable to what had made the previous one vulnerable. He worked with the particular intensity of a man converting loss into improvement, and when it was done, he stood in the doorway of it for a moment with his hands at his sides and looked at what he had made, and Clara, who happened to be crossing the yard at that moment, caught his eye. He said nothing, but he nodded at her a brief, complete nod, the kind that contains a sentence. She nodded back. The years that followed built themselves the way good things build slowly with setbacks, with the particular texture of real life that is nothing like the stories told about it afterward. The summer of 1875 brought the first full harvest of the kitchen garden that Clara had planted in May, and on an evening in August when the light was long and golden, and the mountains were the particular saturated blue, they turned in the late summer heat. Arlo came in from the corrals and found a beet in the vegetable basket and held it up with an expression of genuine surprise, as though a beet were a remarkable thing. And something about the expression made Clara laugh, actually laugh in a way she had not heard herself laugh in longer than she could precisely account for. Elias in the doorway to the front room heard it. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It took her a moment to identify it because it was an expression she associated with people who were experiencing something good that they had not expected to experience and were not certain they were permitted to keep. Seth built 2 new rooms onto the house that fall. He did not discuss the purpose of the rooms. He did not need to. In November of 1875, their first child was born. Elias was there for the birth, and his hands, which Clara had observed over 14 months doing everything from repairing fences in 40 below cold to handling injured animals with extraordinary precision, were not steady when he held the baby for the first time. She understood that he was not shaking from fear. He looked down at the child and then up at Clara, and what passed between them in that moment was beyond the management of words, which she recognized as one of the qualities of things that are real. They exceed the language available to describe them. "She has Margaret's eyes," he said. "I know," Clara said. They named her Margaret because the name belonged here, because the house had been carrying it for long enough in the locked room of its grief, and it was time for it to be said aloud in the context of something new. Seth's face when he heard the name was the face of a man who had not expected to be moved and was moved anyway. Arlo went outside and stood in the yard for a long time, and when he came back in, he was carrying the first cold air of November on his coat, and his eyes were bright with something that was both grief and its opposite, the way things that are truly felt are always both things at once. The winters that followed were each their own particular trial because the winters at Callaway Ridge were not seasonal inconveniences but genuine forces, and the springs that came after them were each their own particular gift. They lost cattle in the hard winter of 1876-12, had in a cold snap that came in February and stayed until March, and the 3 men worked around the clock for 3 weeks. And Clara kept the house running and the food coming and the accounts in order. And when it was over and the losses were tallied and the surviving herd was assessed, Elias sat at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "We're still standing." "We're still standing," she agreed. He looked up at her. "Because of the water channel. The north pasture held because of the water. Because you and Seth and Arlo built the channel," she said. "Because you showed us where to put it," he said. This was not a small exchange. She understood it as a full accounting first without reservation by a man who did not offer things without meaning them. Seth found Harriet Voss at a Helena livestock auction in the spring of 1882. She was a widow with a daughter and a clear-eyed, practical quality that Seth recognized Clara thought because it was something he had learned to recognize by watching Clara for 8 years. He brought her to the ranch for a Sunday dinner in July, and the dinner was the most complicated domestic event Callaway Ridge had hosted since the wedding, not because of any difficulty between the people in the room, but because of the accumulated weight of all the years and the unsaid things that a meal like this carried. Harriet Voss was competent and direct and did not perform warmth. She did not feel, which meant the warmth she did feel was completely credible. She looked at Seth the way people look at something they have found unexpectedly and are not yet certain they are entitled to want. Clara recognized the look. She had worn it herself once. After dinner, while the men were outside, Harriet said to Clara, "He's not easy to know." "No," Clara said, "but he's worth the effort." Harriet looked at her for a moment. "How long did it take?" Clara thought about the moved anvil, the mended button, the bread that had been baked the morning she arrived. "It took as long as it took," she said, "and then one day it was done." That evening after dinner, when the men had gone outside to walk the property in the long summer light, she and Harriet heard it through the open kitchen window, the fiddle playing from the direction of the new forge. Harriet turned toward the sound. "He plays," she asked. "When he thinks no one can hear," Clara said. "He's been playing alone in that forge for as long as I've been here." Harriet was quiet for a moment, listening. The music coming through the window was not polished or performed. It was the music of a man playing for himself, the kind of playing that reveals rather than presents. "He won't have to anymore," Harriet said. It was not quite a question. Arlo never married. This was his choice, made with the same deliberate attention he brought to every other significant choice in his life. And the people who knew him understood it not as a lack, but as a preference, as the preference of a person whose emotional life was broad enough and full enough in the shape it had taken that altering the shape felt unnecessary. He was uncle to Margaret and to the 2 boys who came after her, and he was the person all 3 children came to when they had questions they could not ask their parents, and he drew their portraits with the same ink-stained hands that had written the letter that started everything, and the drawings hung in every room of the house that had once kept all its evidence of love behind a locked door. The silver brush set remained on the parlor mantelpiece. No one ever moved it. By 1890, the ranch had expanded along the lines Clara had first sketched in the winter of her arrival. The water channel built and proven through 15 seasons, the north acreage supporting a herd that would have seemed implausible to the 3 men who had been defending it against Dole's lawyers in the spring of 1875. Copper Falls had grown and Agnes Purcell had retired, and the world had changed in the particular way that the world changes when you are busy living in it, so that the changes accumulate without announcement until you look back and see that the distance covered is extraordinary. 30 years. In the autumn of 1904, Clara Calloway stood on the south porch of the house that Seth had built and rebuilt and expanded across 3 decades, and looked out at the ridge in the October light. That was the same October light that had been there on the afternoon that she arrived, the same copper-colored illumination on the north face that Arlo had described in the letter that had brought her here, the letter she had taken from the Marshfield files and carried 19 days on a train and read 12 times before she arrived. She was 53 years old. Her hair had gone from honey blonde to the particular silver blonde of women who have spent decades in high-altitude sun, and her hands showed the work of 30 years in the way that working hands always show it, and the lines in her face were the lines of a life lived outdoors in weather that did not make allowances. She had not softened into this place. She had grown into it, which was different. From the yard below, the sound of her grandchildren. Margaret's eldest daughter, 9 years old and named Clara after her grandmother over Margaret's mild protest that it would cause confusion, was chasing Arlo's 3-year-old namesake through the dried stalks of the kitchen garden, while the boy's father, who was Margaret's husband and a man from Billings, who had met Margaret when she was teaching school in Helena and had loved her with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had never had a reason to complicate things, watched from the fence rail with the expression of a man who could not believe his luck. Seth and Harriet's children were grown and gone to their own lives, but they came back for the harvest, and their voices had been in the kitchen yesterday evening. Arlo's voice still in the corrals. 67 years old, moving among the horses with the same ease that had been his at 27, the horses rotating their ears toward him as he passed the way animals do with people they trust. And behind her, Elias. She had heard him come out without turning around. She knew the sound of his step on this porch more completely than she knew the sound of anything else in the world, 30 years having made it as familiar as her own heartbeat. He was 65. He moved more carefully than he had. His hair had gone the silver of old iron, and his hands, when she reached back and found one, were the same hands that had been steady against the storm and unsteady at his daughter's birth. The same hands that had placed a silver brush set on a mantelpiece in the act of the most courageous thing she had ever watched a person do. She took his hand and held it, and they stood together on the porch in the October light and looked out at the ridge. "The north pasture will need the fence repaired before winter," he said. "I know," she said. "The wire is in the south storage shed, third shelf." She felt, without seeing it, the movement at the corner of his mouth, the almost smile that was not quite a smile and had become over 30 years more familiar to her than most people's full expressions. "I know where I put it," he said. "I know you do," she said. Below them, little Clara shrieked with laughter as the 3-year-old caught up to her and seized her coat hem with both hands, and the sound went up into the October air and toward the mountain, and the mountain which had stood through all of it, the winters and the fights and the grief and the long, slow building of a life, received it without comment. She had stepped off a train in the October of 1874 and stood alone on a platform with one valise and a letter worn soft from reading. And there had been no one there, and the mountains had been immense and indifferent, and the cold had been coming, and she had calculated her resources and found them sufficient and walked toward the light in the window at the end of the main street. She had found in that window a woman who recognized what was needed and provided it without ceremony. She had found in the house on the ridge 3 men who were each carrying something they had not been taught to put down in a house that had organized itself around the weight of it. She had chosen to stay, which was different from having stayed. She had chosen it every day since, in the way that every significant choice requires daily renewal. The choice to build, rather than endure, to open, rather than lock, to ask the direct question and accept the complete answer, to do the work whose consequences you can see. 30 years on a porch with October light on the copper face of the ridge, the silver brush on the mantelpiece still catching the firelight. A name spoken aloud in every room of the house where it had once only been kept behind a locked door. She had come here to stay. She had stayed. The rest had been everything.